everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Ayman. So today's episode is going to be another interview, and I'm really sorry to all those who like my podcast because it's very short episodes, 20-minute sort of bite-sized chunks. I know that's not the only reason, but yeah, as you can see, this episode and the previous interviews have been substantially longer. Obviously, that's to do with the format, and it's much more difficult to do interviews, in that same concise way. And I will get back to doing more solo episodes, but for the time being, I really enjoy doing these interviews, and I really hope you appreciate them. Today's interview is with someone who I value a lot. She's one of my favorite people. Her name is Nada Homsi. She is a Syrian-Palestinian Texan who I met in Beirut many moons ago. And in this interview, I talk a lot about a cafe called Cafe Yunus. And one thing I miss most about Beirut is the fact that I could go to a cafe and just bump into people, bump into friends, new friends, old friends. And we just instantly have, these long, exhausting, hilarious, depressing, fascinating conversations. And so the interview you're about to listen to is kind of like one of those. And I was so happy to be able to sit with her and talk about everything about Beirut, about her work as a journalist, about the war situation, the genocide in Gaza, and I don't know, just how she's doing. I really hope you enjoy this interview, and I really hope you stay with me as I'm doing more of these, hopefully interspersed a bit more with shorter content. And before I begin, I've got one little announcement. I have created a subseries of Politically Depressed called Keep This Between Us. And it's a Patreon exclusive subseries, which is just me telling stories. Stuff that's not necessarily the most relevant thing, but stories that I like telling, things that have happened in my past, or just new stuff that's happening that I don't necessarily want to talk about on the main feed here, which I want to keep, quite relevant to current political, social, blah, blah, blah. So if you're interested in checking that out, consider becoming a member of our Patreon by heading over to patreon.com/firethesetimes and become a member for as little as $5 a month. You'll get access to this podcast and all its episodes, including Keep This Between Us, as well as direct access to all the podcasts that are created under the Fire These Times, as well as exclusive content and an invitation to our monthly hangout. And yeah, anyway, that's done with. And so yeah, without further ado, I hope you enjoy this interview. Hi, Nada. Would you like to introduce yourself however way you see fit?
Sure. Hello, Ayman. My name is Nada Homsi. I'm a journalist and I am Ayman's friend, I hope.
That's it?
Yeah. Do you want me to go more in depth with
I don't know,
Yeah, well, I usually just ask questions of other people. I'm the one that's used to interviewing people, so I don't often have people asking me questions. So, okay, let's see. How would I want this question answered if I was asking it? I'm a journalist. I'm a correspondent at this newspaper called The National. I've been in Lebanon for 8 years, turbulent years, lovely years, horrible years, but overall, very good.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because on the one hand, I do want to just record this episode because I think you're very interesting, but also the conversations we've had before have always been really fascinating and go in different directions. I also want to talk to you, you're in Beirut. I'm not anymore, and it's a struggle, but at the same time, yeah. And also, yeah, I've known you for, I think, 5 years now. And I'm thinking of titling this episode, the last 5 years have been incredibly fucked up
Yes, they have.
with Nada Homsi.
Yeah.
But I'll ask you the question that I've been asking people, which I think is very telling that it's a difficult question. How are you?
Yeah, it is a difficult question because usually we don't have to answer it honestly when we're just having passing conversation. I'm good, I would say overall, but that's mostly because I've learned to be desensitized because with my work, we eventually become, and this is horrible to say, but eventually we become like doctors that are looking at medical cases. We just get kind of used to hearing the news, and in a way, it helps us not have to absorb the news, even though we're very much absorbing it and developing it and writing it and so on. When you think about it too much on a personal level, it gets to be really heavy. Of course, now I'm talking about Gaza because that's the main thing that's happening right now. But working kind of lets me feel, it gives me an outlet. It lets me feel like I'm at least doing something. And it kind of also puts a space between me and this very personal and also international giant event that's happening in the world that is basically us watching the world fail.
Completely. Yeah. I mean, I feel sort of similar with this podcast compared to I started this 2 months ago, and there's definitely a feeling of at least like sort of channeling it through this, channeling some of those feelings or like thoughts or discussions that I want to be having that I'm not having because I'm here in Vienna and I don't know many people, but also do not have those connections whereby I know I'll have those. I don't have a Cafe Eunice, or a wherever or a friend's house where I know a lot of people show up. But yeah, how are you feeling in Beirut at the moment? Because obviously there's a lot of different, whenever I talk to my mother, she's like, oh, I'm fine. Whatever will happen. But then obviously I know a lot of people who are kind of really worried. I myself, it's been a few months I've been debating whether I should go visit or not. And I hate that struggle. I hate so much that I feel unsafe going back home. And it's one thing that I really hold against the Zionist state. You know what I mean? That they've created that situation. But yeah, so how do you feel with the sort of like low-lying war, or I mean, pretty real war in the south, but you're in Beirut.
Yeah. This it's a war that's happening that you can't feel like through your life in Beirut. For me, استسلمت. Like I'm here. I'm not Lebanese, but I'm not going to let the Israelis prevent us from living our lives. For me, it's also a matter of just staying and living our lives normally, despite the fact that there is this war going on. And of course, like doing what we can and covering it in my case. And it's an interesting time in that I get different kind of exposure to it than most people. So I get to speak to like security sources and people in Hamas and people in the PIJ and people in Hezbollah and so on, and and also people in the army and whatever. But you get to see things from a perspective that most people in Beirut, I think, don't. Like today, for example, I was taking the service home, and there were these two passengers in the back seat of the car. They were Lebanese, like I'm pretty sure. And this girl was asking this other girl if she remembers March 14. And the other girl asked her, what year did it happen? And she said, well, it happened in 2005. And the other girl said, oh, maybe it was 2 years old back then. So I think in Beirut specifically, there is often a disconnect amongst certain people of certain classes from the reality of life in Lebanon. But especially now with the war happening in the south, for a lot of people, it's like it's not really happening. And then whenever there's an assassination in Dahi, for example, it's kind of a rude awakening of like, oh yeah, there is actually this war happening in the south. So in a lot of ways, I think people in the South feel like it's a different country.
Yeah.
They say this a lot, like we're also Lebanon, and you guys are forgetting that we're also Lebanon.
No, definitely, yeah, for sure. And also even with Dahia, where
Yeah.
we are also Beirut,
Mm,
because there's so much of a peripheralization and sort of like, yeah.
yeah, exactly.
I don't know, do you think it'll escalate? I mean, I know Israel is obviously pushing for it. It's quite clear. It's a very scary feeling, sort of relying on the patience of Hezbollah, or the kind of reservedness. And for the last 6 months, they've been very fucking reserved. But yeah, I don't know. What are your readings on that? Sorry, I know I said I wasn't going to do analysis. You don't have to.
No, that's my fault too, because it's my work, right? So you asking me questions, and my answer it's like work is a big part of my life, and in many ways, it you can't separate it when you can't separate your life, your work life from your personal life when you're doing journalism in a lot of ways. So that's my own fault for going there in the first place. Yeah, I don't know. It did strike me today, though, that it has been 6 months and they've been really restrained in their responses. And I realized that Hezbollah, Iran, the quote unquote axis of resistance, whatever you want to call it, they don't really have to do anything to not win. They don't have to do anything to watch Israel lose, if that makes sense. They're definitely doing a war of attrition. Israel is definitely getting crazier and crazier as time goes on. I mean, they hit a fucking embassy 2 days ago. When was the last time that a sovereign nation hit the embassy of another sovereign nation on?
It's crazy.
Yeah. So then they're just getting crazier and crazier and crazier and getting more and more isolated by the international community. And meanwhile, Iran and Hezbollah, like they have to do the bare minimum. They have to keep the conflict contained and not get dragged into a war. But really, they're just sitting back and watching Israel blow up in terms of isolating itself politically. It's really easy to say that now, of course, but it's been what, 76 years of saying eventually Israel's going to blow itself up and so on. It always comes back to the fold of the international community. So maybe this is the breaking point and maybe it's not. Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the one thing that's kind of really driven me crazy over the last 6 months, but honestly over the last few years, is that illusion of the breaking point of I talked very early on in this podcast of it. You know, I remember so clearly October 17, right, of last year, when they first bombed, I think, El Ahle Hospital or El Shifa,
Mm.
the first major whatever. And there was that feeling of this is it. And then it just went on. And then all the people sort of defended it and they just kept. And now, obviously, every hospital's been bombed and the entire healthcare system is completely destroyed.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But then again, like every little bit, like then they attack this, they do this, they use white phosphorus, they do this. It's that feeling of there is no real red line. And I connect that obviously in the last 6 months, it's been pretty obvious, and most people listening will have experienced that. But for me, that has a longer history with especially like the explosion in Lebanon. Like, do you remember that feeling right afterwards where it's like, they can't, the regime in Lebanon cannot survive this. This is insane. And honestly, I think that's why the first month afterwards was a bit easier than month two, three, four, when things just, oh no, they're just going to actually cover this up. They're just going to beat people up who are protesting. They're going to sort of like assassinate people working on the case and like intimidate whatever.
Yeah.
And life kind of went on as normal.
And you realize they were going to survive this.
Yeah. And so it's been really difficult. I keep thinking of this concept of rock bottom. You know what I mean? You think you hit rock bottom and then bam. And again, the story I always tell about the explosion is, you know, Ben.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he was my editor at the time. We were really good friends. And he was at my apartment at the time on the day. We were working on an essay called Hope or Despair,
Hmm.
because this is a few months into the
Pretty on
revolution.
brand for you.
Yeah, I know. But, and so that really reveals the kind of inability to predict the future. It's fucking with my understanding of reality. And the last 5 years have just completely demolished my understanding of reality. Such that now when I'm here in Europe, I'm just completely alienated. It's very difficult for me to talk to people or to relate to people on any real level because I just sort of like the calibration. I don't know. My partner sometimes talks about like courts or laws, and I just don't, I don't understand what those mean anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I bring this up with you because, yeah, I think we met only a few months before October 17, 2019, like the revolution. I remember I was at a party and I heard some cool gal talk about Seinfeld. And I turned around and it was you. And I was like, oh my God, talking about Seinfeld. Which obviously now I have a very different relationship with Seinfeld because he's a fucking Zionist
Yeah.
asshole. He was then, but now it's,
Imprinted in your mind now even more. It's like with every successive war, it gets imprinted in your mind a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. Seinfeld is a Zionist. Seinfeld is a Zionist, and yeah. But you do that thing where you look up celebrities all the time, and you're like so and so
yeah.
Zionist, and you just check if they're Zionist or not.
I kind of do a weird like benefit of, not benefit of the doubt, benefit of the guilty or whatever.
Mm,
But yeah, I have been rewatching the same shows over and over again because I'm scared of watching new things and then discovering, you know.
Yeah. I
It's
every actor or actress I like, my immediate go-to is so and so a Zionist. And I need to stop doing that because it ruins a little bit the TV show or movie or whatever it is, the value of it. And sometimes this is a long debate that many people have had separating the artist from the art and so on. Uh Seinfeld, I like to enjoy Seinfeld on its own without thinking about the politics of behind the people who've created it. It's a brilliant sitcom.
it's brilliant. It's great. George Costanza was my idol growing up.
He's amazing. I don't
It's
know.
great.
Yeah, he's the best character.
Yeah. Oh, the best character in the show for sure. I've grown on Elaine much more these days, like whenever I rewatch it.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's fantastic. It's a very funny character to genuinely, I modeled myself after him, like him and Woody Allen. Again, another really fucking problematic person who, problematic. He's a sexual abuser.
Mm.
And, but yeah, to the point that when people would meet me, let's say circa 2016, 17, would say like, oh, you're basically like Woody Allen. Because I would do the whole, I'm so neurotic and I'm thinking about this and, oh, I noticed that you moved your leg. Is that a sign of, did I say something wrong?
Mm.
But George Costanza, yeah, like this guy's a loser. I think that's one thing that makes it really easy to watch. And regardless of whatever, like these are not winners,
Yeah,
you know? He's miserable.
yeah.
And
He's himself. That's the best
yeah,
thing about it, is that he is pretty unapologetically himself in the show, and I appreciate that.
but even Bob Dylan, I have the same problem.
Yeah. Leonard Cohen. I fucking love Leonard Cohen.
Yeah.
And there's a really good song. There's a really good song that I love. And he wrote it during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And he sang it to the troops. And it's a really good song. And it is just like obviously a horrible legacy and a horrible story. So when I heard that story, I was like, well, fuck, because it's a good song.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Later on in life, did Leonard Cohen become an anti-Zionist? I don't know enough about him, or did he stop being such a Zionist? I actually don't know. Anyway, it's a really good song. I'll send it to you.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
No, with Bob Dylan, it's this weird thing where like his first seven albums I treasure with all my heart and I know every song. And the politics are quite interesting and cool and radical and different and kind of moving beyond the kind of liberal ideals of the 60s, whatever, of like white organizing and political thought of the 60s. Um, but then it's like, I think 82, he writes a song called Neighborhood Bully, wherein it's the most Zionist bullshit, ridiculous. It's this thing where it's like his enemies want him dead, but he's the neighborhood bully. This is probably the third time I've done a Bob Dylan impression on this podcast. Because I think I do
I
it pretty
haven't heard
well.
that one. It's a really good impression. No, I haven't heard that specific song. I love Bob Dylan. Um, but in line with that, like brilliant people that you would think, I don't know about Bob Dylan's politics or his critical thinking. At the end of the day, he's a musician, but people that you think that would know better, based off of their politics and previous work that they've done, that just end up being Zionists, and you realize like, are they employing critical thinking? I really wonder. Like we were talking the other day about the 5-hour debate between Benny Morris
Mm.
and Ryan Rabbani and Norman Finkelstein and that Destiny guy. And like Benny Morris knows better. We all know Benny Morris knows better. He just doesn't give a shit. مش لمصلحته.
I know, but so that's a very interesting conversation because then I do think of ideology, and here I use a lot of Zizek, who I denounce, I condemn, fuck him, but his ideas of ideology I think are very important, and how he analyzes ideology today, because it's not people going out and saying I am this way, I am this way. It's very subsumed. It's almost subconscious, and so it's
Mhm.
like I can't believe that any of these people actively are lying all the time. That they're writing their essays, their 1,000 word, their books, and they're like, There's ideology. It's a thing that they don't know they know. Actually, Zizek did an interesting thing with Rumsfeld. I find this very funny. Rumsfeld's metaphysics.
Mm-mm.
It's a classic one. He says, there are known knowns and there are known unknowns. and there are unknown unknowns, things we don't know. And this is one of his defenses for weapons of mass destruction, IDOC.
Mm.
And so Zizek comes in, he's like, but there's a third, or rather, if you follow the logic, I'm not going to do my Zizek impersonation.
It was
There's a
good. You
fourth.
were off to a good start.
I know I stopped myself because I do get worked up.
Yeah.
There's a fourth one, if you follow that logic, which is the unknown known.
Mm.
The thing we don't know, we know. And so I've been thinking a lot about this these days because obviously, when we think of people who know better, who have studied, who have read and whatever, that's a separate thing from a kind of morality. Because I've been realizing these days with, what Israel's doing and how intensely fucked up it is and every day and how obvious it all is when you approach someone and you tell them, this is racist or this is a genocide. It's like if someone says something racist and you say that's racist, it comes with this assumption that therefore you shouldn't say it because it's bad. But racists don't think they're doing something bad. This is my favorite thing from screenwriting, actually,
Mm.
that evil people in films or whatever, like people who are doing bad don't think they're doing bad. They think they're saving the world, and that's the mark of a good villain in a show, in a film or whatever. It's
Mhm.
not someone who's like, I'm evil. It's someone who's like, no, we need to save humanity. And in order to save humanity, we need green technology. And in order to get the green technology, we need these minerals and these, what's it called? And so, yeah, I'm sorry if there's child slavery in the Congo. This, you know what I mean? Like it's a horrible, horrendous thing what they're defending, but they have a kind of logic of their own. It really scares me. And I think a lot about this with like transphobia and queerphobia, that like a lot of people just don't think transphobia is a serious thing, a thing to be concerned of. This is one of the last things I learned from ContraPoints before I've like just completely canceled it in my mind because girl has been completely absent the last 6 months, so fuck her. Which is in the US, there is this ideal at least that like racism, it's acknowledged, is bad because you shouldn't judge someone or treat someone based on racial categories or whatever. But then transphobes don't have that about that this is a trans person and there's not that agreement. So it's like you call someone a transphobe and they're just like, yes. And they're just brazen about it.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
People do. No one thinks they're evil. They all think they're doing the right thing, but I don't know. You could say it's internalized racism, but they do know it's racism. There's this guy, Hamza, that he's like a social media guy that goes on chat roulette and he films his interactions with Israelis.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, I don't know if you've seen his stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting ones was when he spoke with, they're always teenagers for some reason, but he spoke with this young girl and he said, "You're racist." And she was like, "Yeah, yeah, I am racist." And he's like, "What? You're just cool with that you're racist?" And she's like, "Yeah, they teach us to be racist in school." And he was like, "Okay, and do you think that's okay?" And she's like, "Yeah, for sure it's okay. Of course it's okay." Because she, in her head, really believes that the Palestinians are trying to destroy Israel, blah, blah, blah. And, to a certain extent, yeah, fuck Israel as
Yeah.
a racist entity, like fuck Israel, in those terms. So like, yeah, I get that people feel threatened and that people think that they're doing the right thing. But when you scrutinize and you use critical thinking and logic, and you have these and you engage with them and you like poke at the holes in the logic, the majority of people, for some reason, instead of listening, will just close up. And I'm sorry to bring it back to the debate, but that debate really, I didn't even watch all 5 hours. But to bring it back, I mean, there were some really good points being made. And in my opinion, the Zionist talking points were so weak in comparison to the other arguments that were being made. But the Zionist side just clammed down. Like Benny Morris clammed down, doubled down. And when I say he knows better, it's like, he was one of the foremost historians that wrote about the Nakba. And here he was in this debate saying, like, the Nakba didn't necessitate the eradication of Palestinians and their forced exodus, or their forced eviction. It was just because they fought against the UN partition
Mm.
that Israel had to do that. They were forced into doing it. The Palestinians forced Israel's hand. And to me, like when you've shut down and you aren't willing to listen, and they're just doubling down on talking points, that is the point where, in my opinion, they stop being a good person. I know, who am I to say whether someone is good or bad? And they're not going to believe they're a bad person. They're still thinking that they're good people. Yeah, but I think also good, bad, good, evil, they're not relevant in this world anymore. These aren't real things, good and evil. Nothing is
No.
good, nothing is evil.
Because I mean, again, and like that young girl who just says, I mean, it reminds me of Gibran Basile, you know? He just goes on, he says, yes, I am a racist, so what, you know? Because a lot of it is just about power. Like, why do I have to acknowledge? I don't know. This is supremacist thought. And when I say like they think they're doing good, I'm not trying to do this like humanizing of like they're human too, which they are. But the point is like when trying to engage or like argue, I find myself, it's impossible. I get so frustrated because I know, from the very get-go, the question being asked, like I can see the layers behind it. And behind it all, there isn't a logic, there isn't a critical thinking. It's just this is the way it should be. And I think a lot about like prison abolitionists or some, or for example, because you ask most people, should prisons exist? They say yes, and you know what I mean? Like there's like a very basic kind of there's not really a logic that people have of it, but there's this like a kind of intuitiveness, let's say, that our society brings up, that this very like carceral society brings up, which is like bad people go away.
Yeah, they don't know any other way. They've never been faced with any other options. So that's to them is like bad people go to jail.
They need to be kept away. Yeah, they made the choice.
Mm.
So no, I don't know. I remember months ago having a lot more time for like let's engage in debate or discussion or whatever, not with Zionists themselves, but like with sort of whatever Zionist adjacent ideas. And again, in Europe, I'm also broadening it into like with white people who have not unlearned their whiteness, and so come at me with a lot of bullshit.
Yeah. Mm.
I have no energy for it. I mean, I had no energy. I'm very impressed that you were able to watch at least like 3, 4 hours of this debate
2.5
between
hours, to be clear, not even close to 4 hours. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I find myself I was watching a little documentary of Edward Said from the 80s, and it was him debating some Zionist guy, and I couldn't handle like 2 minutes of it because it was so frustrating.
Boils your blood immediately.
Why so yeah.
Yeah, it just gets rises and rises and rises. But I think you said something interesting now about this concept of, like you were saying, that they don't question their power. But I don't think they need, like, people that are in positions of power, like Gibran Bassil, for example, they don't need to question their power. They are in power. So when we're talking about racism or carceral states, we have people that are in power that don't need to change the way that they are because they're in power. So nothing is forcing them to really think about it, not even in a critical way. They don't care. And then you have the other side that's doing everything in its power to, like, please use your brain, apply logic to this. This isn't right. Here are all of the other alternatives to to the carceral state, or to the idea that Israel should exist as a safe haven exclusively for the Jewish people, or what have you. You could apply it to any logic. But I think the main issue is that people have they have no reason to question their power. They're comfortable in their power, which is natural. It's human nature. But when someone isn't willing to just listen to someone less powerful, I mean, that's the downfall of
Hmm.
humanity. That's where we are right now.
Yeah.
That's where we've been for a while.
It's been for a while. And I mean, in a more macro sense, essentially what the state of Israel has done over the last 50 years or so, 70 years is, and again, my God, I hate this because another Edward Said essay from 1975, Zionism from the perspective of its victims, already is so eloquently describing how by this insistence on creating an ethno state of Jewish supremacy, that it is daily, constantly quashing any possibility for anything else. And over the last 5 years, we've seen that because I remember very well 4 years ago, the Great March of Return, you know, I remember the quote unquote peace process. I've read a lot about whatever and all these things. And so essentially, I mean, armed struggle has always been a thing since the 60s, since the Palestinian Revolution.
Well, even before that, yeah. Armed struggle has always been a thing, like you said.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
In general, especially
Yeah.
against colonialism.
Mm.
But it's just this really frustrating situation wherein I'm very aware, and obviously coming in Lebanon, knowing, what the resistance can turn into and the politics that it has. And especially now, I mean, it's not, the only ever form of resistance is whatever Hamas is in terms of like an entire political structure and movement. And it's actually I hate how quashed, rather minimized or reduced Hamas is. There's like no room to discuss it as like but then in general, how then the concept of armed struggle is reduced then to that which is already reduced, which is essentially just a kind of, again, another ideological thing of terrorism. Terrorism is one of the most ideologically loaded terms. And I bring this up a lot because now if I use the word terrorist, I think a lot of people, especially in the West, have a very clear idea in their head. But if you were to go to the UK 20 years ago and talk about terrorists, they think of the Irish. Or 40 years ago in Germany, they think of left wing, like radical groups that are hijacking planes.
Mm.
Obviously, in our experience, the biggest terrorist organizations in the world are men that wear suits, or white men, or people who are leaders of the former, still present imperialist powers. But so I find myself, even before getting into any of this discussion, so scared and so like nervous all the time. And I know a lot of people feel this because we do live in very carceral and surveyed states. And so even just talking about armed struggle, which is then associated to this, which is then associated to this, makes it very difficult to talk about. And then on the other hand, it's very difficult because there's no space to be critical at all of Hamas at the moment. Again, because it's like you're pegged as like, it's like matched with condemning the whatever, and then therefore siding with the genocide. It's just, I don't know. It's been very difficult to have any conversations these days, especially because it feels like nothing fucking matters. And yeah.
Nothing fucking matters. This, like you have just brought up this big thing that I've been thinking about for a long time. First of all, I feel like I have very few outlets and people to talk to about these things because the leftist community in Lebanon has just gotten tighter and tighter and tighter since 2019 until the majority of people have left. So I don't have that much of an outlet to discuss this. But the idea of resistance and the fact that resistance to the occupation has been bottled into the axis of resistance, which is like, Hezbollah, Iran, and allies of Iran, is so frustrating because it is, all right, I'm not phrasing myself correctly, but in Lebanon, for example, out of necessity, Hezbollah is leading the resistance. Hezbollah is leading the resistance because it is the main force that is preventing all-out war from breaking out across the border, despite the fact that it had initially initiated the conflict in order to support Hamas and so on. But basically, it has to be at the top of the resistance because it has to be the one to control things in Lebanon. But what happens is that the resistance, the actual armed groups, the Palestinians that are actively fighting for their own liberation, get marginalized. Even the way that Palestine is talked about. Like I'm in these Telegram groups because it helps when you're following what's going on. And there's one called Lebanon News and Updates. And if you ever go into the comments section, it's a big mistake for any comment section anywhere. But especially for this Telegram channel. And it's just a bunch of people that don't know that much about Palestine. They're looking at it purely from a pro-Hezbollah perspective and don't really know that much about the Palestinian resistance or the history of Palestinian resistance from a Palestinian perspective. All they know about it is from like the Lebanese Hezbollah side. And the Lebanese Hezbollah side is very much a Lebanese side, and it is very much a pro-Hezbollah side. It's coming from a very specific political place. Whereas The Palestinian resistance is so much more than that. So I do feel like in a lot of ways, the ways that we talk about Palestine in Lebanon also are muted and or confined and limited sometimes, or even the way that we express resistance.
Yeah, I mean, if there's also like a long history, but again, like looking into history sometimes feels frivolous, especially in this moment of like such intense urgency and crisis. But yeah, Hezbollah has literally not just like a marginalized is sometimes a polite term because sometimes they've killed other resistance fighters and activists and thinkers and whatever. I think of someone like Mehdi Amel or someone like who was this Lebanese Communist Party guy before the Communist Party became disgusting. I don't have to go that far back. I mean, their whole bullshit in Syria with Bashar al-Assad.
George Abdullah.
George Abdullah, لا, I was meaning like George Hello, مش Hello.
George Habash from the
No, no, no,
PFLP.
no. Lebanese Communist Party. He was like allied with Kamal Jumblat and
Ishi Abdullah.
no, no,
He's in
it's
like
like
French German. Is his name not George Abdullah?
something Hello.
I don't know.
George Hello? George Howe.
George
George
Howe.
Howe.
Is it George Howe?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it is George
Yeah.
Howe.
Um
Anyway.
But no, I mean only just recently. I mean, yeah, no, it's you don't have to go that far back either. It's their whole alliance with the so-called Axis of Resistance, and with Bashar al-Assad and what they've done in Syria for the last 10 years. I mean, why are they so powerful now? It's because they've trained and killed and done massacres of their own in Syria. And here we actually really, it's a very fucked up example of the kind of ideological hypocrisy we were talking about earlier, which is I have noticed a lot of very interesting and really important Syrian voices that are staying like relatively quiet because there's such a resurgence of this like very brazen discussion of the axis of resistance as though it exists, as though the last 10 years haven't happened. And very specifically, like some of the most disgusting things the Zionists have done, like mocking Palestinians who are starving, who they are starving, and like Hezbollah did the exact same thing to communities they were besieging in Syria,
Hmm.
like this mockery. And a lot of these voices that we see on Twitter now who are saying these really good stuff on Palestine have a very disgusting history and still presently like talk so much shit about what's happening in the north of Syria and what happened in Syria for the last 10 years. And they use the exact same war on terror language. Oh, they are terrorists. They must be exterminated. And that's exactly what the Israelis are saying. So it's this bizarre. And I remember very early on, a lot of the images that people were circulating, they did not know that they were circulating images from Syria, children crying, bombed out hospitals, whatever, and saying, like, look what the Israelis are doing to Palestinians. And this is literally an image of what the Syrian regime were doing to Syrians. And the people posting them were literally the same people who were championing and are still championing the Assad regime. So it's this really fucked up hypocrisy, but it's the ideology,
Hmm.
which blinds you to certain types of suffering and yeah, makes you think, there are certain like means to ends.
Yeah. It's really frustrating to see that there is exactly like you said, a resurgence of people that were pro-Assad now being like repeated. Their words are being repeated all over the place in terms of their position on Palestine. And by the same token, you also have people that were really pro-Syrian opposition at the time, or Syrians that are part of the opposition, sort of championing this. I haven't seen a full-on chant like "Yay Israel" or anything in the last few months, but a certain silence.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it is Hezbollah at the forefront of the resistance. And I think we need to remember, and we do remember, but I think it's just really important to keep in mind for a lot of people that Hezbollah is not the resistance and Hamas is not the resistance. They're aspects of a resistance. They're the most powerful aspects of the resistance at the moment. And it's like people like are always like you're a Hamas supporter, you guys are Hamas supporters, Palestinians are Hamas supporters. Palestinians are not Hamas supporters. I remember that this was a huge thing. I mean, the two main political parties were Hamas and Fatah. People were disillusioned with Fatah. They were starting to go to more towards Hamas, not necessarily out of a love for Hamas, but because it was the only powerful option and it was perceived as actually doing something towards Palestinian liberation. So, like, whether we agree with Hamas or not, that's an internal discussion for us to have. but they are like part of a resistance. But it's also really important to keep in mind that they're not the main resistance, and neither is Hezbollah. And when we're looking at it from that lens, then we get to what you're saying, which is some Syrians being silent on Gaza and pro-Assadists being very vocal on Gaza, when in reality, it shouldn't matter. Hezbollah's role in this conflict should not be how we calibrate whether we support
Yeah,
or don't support what's
definitely not.
happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I find that really so like the only mass protests in solidarity with Gaza and Syria are happening in Idlib or in the sort of like areas that the regime that doesn't control. And we don't see these mass protests in the regime areas. And I really sometimes wonder, and it's like a really depressing thought because again, the last 10 years have been so destructive and so many of the experiments that have been I was just having the last interview I had was with a Sudanese writer and the revolution and things that were forming during the revolution and how that's also been crushed over the last year with the war since April.
Yeah.
But like what could the resistance have been if the Assad regime fell, you know? Or what could the resistance look like and what could the region look like, you know, if Sisi never did his coup and took over? I don't know, like there's so many potential futures that could have had been. Sorry, I don't know if that's a proper grammatical tense.
So many what ifs. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's this phrase that I heard, I think it's attributed to Marwan Barghouti, which is that despair is the colonization of the future.
Hmm. Yeah. And then like you said, where the part where you said that there's no big protests happening in government Syria, there aren't any big protests happening in government Syria because the regime is very much controlling the output because it's terrifying because they don't want big protests for Palestine because then they'll feel pressure to actually act and do something for Palestine. The Syrian state is completely incapacitated.
I think beyond that, though, it's that they don't want these people gathering and talking because it's going to very quickly turn to something else. You know
Yeah,
what I
that's what I
mean?
was just about to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, and yeah, exactly. So they don't want that and they're terrified of that. And at the same time, oh, I lost my train of thought. But basically that was it.
Oh, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, no, it's okay. You said basically what I was going to say. I can't remember if there was a third point in there somewhere. I do that a lot. I have a lot of brain fog these days, and that's happened a lot since October 7.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you noticed the same thing, or is this just a symptom of getting older? I don't know.
I think we're the same age.
No, I'm older than you.
How old are you?
I'm almost 36.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Hi. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm
How
gonna
old are
turn
you?
I'm gonna turn 30 this summer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. The 30s are good.
No, but brain fog is not a concept I think of anymore because it's like the fog has been there for years now. And so, you know, the norm has shifted. And so I forget what it's like to have my head above the clouds, or not the clouds, the fog.
Yeah. I remember what it was like. I was clear-headed. I used to be a clear-headed person. I was always chaotic, but at least I was clear-headed about my chaos. Now I don't know what I'm doing while I'm doing it half the time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you're just doing.
I'm just doing. I was gonna say it's like a constant trauma response. Like it's all adrenaline constantly, and when the adrenaline's not happening and there is no adrenaline, the baseline is confusion and brain fog.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was having this conversation with the Sado Hassan yesterday or last week. It's like being a shark. It's the analogy I'm using. You have to just keep moving because the minute you stop, you just,
Yeah.
yeah,
That's a really good way of putting it.
thank you.
Yeah.
But there was a time before when if I were to say that and we would connect on that kind of like, oh yeah, I'm feeling that too, there's a kind of slight mental liberation from the coherence of the situation. This was my conversation with Lina Munzir, which was that like the naming of it used to be kind of cathartic. It used to then help clear the brain fog, but it never goes away. I just have new terms for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now you know it's just there. It's thick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. How's your life? How's your day to day? I mean, with all this stuff and with I don't know.
Honestly, I threw myself into my work for a lot of reasons. In a way, also, since 2020, I think a lot of people feel this socially. There's not as much cohesion as there used to be. And a lot of people that I knew have left and so on. So, like you were talking about earlier, there's not a Cafe Yunus that I go to, and there's not a friend's house that I go to. Well, it's the same in Lebanon also. But I've noticed that a lot of the newer generation of people, the foreigners that come post 2019, they have a cohesion.
Yeah.
But then the other ones, the older ones, they've just been like like I feel like disoriented. But a
Mm.
lot of that has to do, I think, with because of the chaotic nature of my marriage, and then also uh during since 2019 until now, and then also the fact that a lot of crazy stuff has been happening over the
Yeah.
years, politically speaking. Yeah.
No, it's funny you bring up Cafe Eunice again because again, like a year ago, I had much more space for the sentimentality of like the fact that Cafe Eunice closed and then it reopened. But now it's this like bougie, it's like Calais, but another one, and it just doesn't have that vibe at all. In the last period when I was in Lebanon, I would go to that cafe, but it wasn't the same. I wouldn't meet people. It wasn't that feeling of the chaotic mess. Ugh. But did I see you? Am I remembering wrong? But have you done reporting from the South?
Okay.
Oh, I was so scared.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was scared for you.
Yeah, yeah. It was fine because at the time we didn't know how se serious. We knew it was serious, obviously, it was unprecedented, but we didn't know how serious it was going to be. I went to the South with a change of clothes, thinking I was going to stay there for a night or two and come back to Beirut. We ended up staying there on and off for about a month. The second time I came, I obviously brought more clothes because the first couple of weeks was just like I had to go to the dollar store and buy clothes and underwear at some point. But we didn't know how dangerous it was going to be, I guess.
But hadn't they already killed or assassinated the journalist, the Lebanese journalist? I saw him.
Isam Abdullah. Yeah. So we went on October 8th
Oh, okay.
from the very beginning. Like I think the day that Hezbollah threw the rockets or the day after. I can't remember if we went on October 8 or October 9. And we stayed there. And I remember the day that Isam Abdullah Allah yarhamu passed away or was killed rather by Israel. There was supposed to be protests. Palestinians from the camps were supposed to go to the border and protest because Hamas had been calling, for days of rage and so on. And then there was a decision that they weren't going to be allowed to cross the border. And I had a lot of work to do. We had just finished a bunch of interviews and I had to file. And I was like, okay, well, if there's not going to be any protests and it's just more clashes between Israel and Hezbollah, then I'm just going to stay in the cafe and I'm going to file my story. And I was thinking either nothing is going to happen or Hezbollah has to make up for the fact that it didn't allow the Palestinians to go to the border, so it's going to have to be somehow more aggressive in its fighting. Yeah. And then a few hours later, that's when we found out that the journalists were hit and we were just sitting in a cafe. And I think a lot of me and my colleagues felt a lot of guilt for not having gone when we saw that. It's not something logical, but we just, yeah, kind of felt like we weren't in solidarity with the people that were hit in a way, like we should have been there. Alhamdulillah, we weren't.
Mm.
Yani, you never know what was going to happen. Yeah, and by that point, we'd been caught a few times under strikes. There was shelling periodically happening, but it was before it got to be with the same intensity that is now. Now there's airstrikes constantly, and
Mm.
بالنسبة للكثافة and how do you say it? In terms of the depth and the strength of the strikes, it's a lot more. And before it was shelling, some drone strikes, so on. Now you have actual airstrikes, and before it was the occasional white phosphorus. Now it's constant. So there's been a change. Yeah,
And there's not much reporting from the South because of it.
yeah. It's hard to go there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's dangerous.
Yeah.
So some local journalists now go, and every once in a while, when we have permission to go, we'll go. But it's really dangerous to go to the border areas, and even a few kilometers above the border areas. You don't know what's going to
Mm.
happen and when it's going to happen.
I remember one of the first things the Israelis did in southern Lebanon, October 8, October 9, was use white phosphorus. and then pretty soon after assassinated Aysan. And
Mhm.
there's just this very terrifying, how do I say it? Look what we'll do, and look how far we'll go. And I think only a few days ago they killed a bunch of medics in Lebanon.
Last week, yeah.
And it's the same thing in Gaza. They've been constantly pushing the limits of what is very morbidly described as the limits of war. And it's been so difficult to witness, you know, them kill these international aid workers. And then in his video, he's just smirking. Netanyahu is just smirking, it's like, well, I'm sorry that it's just, they don't give a,
It happened.
yeah, it happened.
Shit
What the
happens.
fuck are you gonna do? But then, yeah, the hospitals, God,
Yeah. We kept thinking they were encroaching their limits, but really the limits were just getting wider and wider.
being pushed.
There are no limits.
And I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, Jesus Christ. I mean, you're an American citizen, right? How are you planning on voting this year?
I'm not gonna vote.
Yeah,
If it's just between Biden and Trump, I'm not voting. I'm unapologetic about that. I don't give a shit. There's people that say if you don't vote, you're, allowing the fascists to win. The fascists have already won. The fascists are already in power. Call me a single issue voter. Don't give a fuck. We have failed the world. I'm not voting.
yeah. I mean, I remember having the exact same conversation with people 5 years ago, 4 years ago, but it's just like, especially now, and especially as far as Biden has gone, and just not just on Israel, honestly, with the border, with Mexico, with a lot of things. I'm not going to get too into it because I actually don't know that much. I used to know more back when I used to think that I was white. I used to think that I was a part of the American system because I'm part of the American empire, but I'm actually peripheral to it.
Do you have US citizenship, by the way?
No.
Okay, cool.
Not at all. No, I'm a very weird case. I only have a Lebanese passport,
Yeah.
born in Saudi, raised in Lebanon. But yeah, I went to an international school in Beirut, this American school, and I watched a lot of TV. And it was like this post 2003 moment, and it was like I was very colonized. I've never lived in the US.
Man, but you felt white and you felt American in some ways culturally.
Yeah.
That is so interesting. You've read Ghassan Haj?
The anthropologist?
Yeah, the anthropologist. Have
Yeah.
you read his work?
Like, not in depth.
Okay. I cannot remember the name of this essay, but in grad school I read it and it was a really great essay and it will never leave my mind. And basically he's talking about this very thing. Well, not exactly this very thing, but the fact that Lebanon is so stratified socially, educationally, culturally, and so on. So he was talking about Lebanese immigrants that would go to Australia and they would feel white. They would feel, basically at the top with respect to the social. Sorry, let me just gather my thoughts because I lost my thoughts while I was speaking. Basically, he was saying that Lebanese immigrants that would go to Australia would think of themselves as white because they're used to in Lebanon being at the top, socially and socioeconomically speaking. In comparison to other nationalities, Lebanese people have full rights, whereas others don't necessarily. And they would not be treated as white people. They would get treated as Arabs. And they'd be like, well, wait a second, we're not Syrians,
Yeah.
we're Lebanese. And it was like a rude awakening for them to realize that they weren't white and they were Arab. Anyway, so this isn't like, this actually isn't very pertinent to you, but it is interesting in terms of how identity is formed. I find that stuff really interesting, how identity is formed and how it changes with respect to the context and the place that you are.
I mean, two main examples for this that come to mind. This is why I love Edward Said. And he very explicitly talks about because he was born in Jerusalem and like went to like school in Cairo and it was a British school. And so there was this feeling like you're part of the British Empire, but you're not of the British. Like you're never allowed to, you can learn our language, you can learn our stuff, but you can never be us.
Mhm.
He had a much, but the Americans have a much different system where it does feel like an ideal of inclusion that anybody can be a part of it and watching the TV. And I felt like I was one of the friends, and then
If
I
you assimilate.
if you
if you
assimilate,
assimilate.
yeah, if you shut the fuck up about Lebanon and about Zionism and whatever. Um, but I had a brief encounter with the US. I was supposed to go to university there, but when I got there, I was like, I don't know anybody. This is terrifying. I talked about this a couple of times already, and it's just like, yeah, I did not feel safe or that I could be myself in any sense of the word. But no, even in Lebanon, growing up, I knew a lot about the US. I mostly know American politics. Like I knew much more about Mitch McConnell than I did about Nabi Berri, you know?
Mm,
Or
that's why,
yeah.
yeah, that might be why that girl in the car didn't know anything about March 14, 2005, and she was like, "I'm maybe I know something about it."
Hmm.
Yeah, maybe it has to do with that. It's like identity gets shifted depending on the pop culture that you consume, the socioeconomic standing that you have. Do you feel more Arab now that you're in Vienna, or less Arab, or about the same?
Wow, actually, asking me questions. Um, I don't know how much has changed since I moved to Vienna, but I think the turning point for me was October 17, where it was the first time that I really had a strong sense of my people and my struggle and my whatever and my community. It was at that point I started relearning Arabic and like really trying to, because again, it was like October 17 happened and I'm in these protests, I'm in these spaces, and it's like I can't talk to people, but also all I know is Noam Chomsky and the Pentagon Papers and bullshit like that. I don't know really March 14, March 8, whatever. I can't talk to people in their like in their language with my people. And then it's like my relationship with Hisham. I don't think you've ever met Hisham,
I did, yep.
but oh, have you? Okay, yeah. And
Yep.
so he's really taught me a lot and helped me unlearn and learn a lot. Since moving here, it's been a weird thing because I do look for Arabs in a way that I've never done before. Because in Lebanon, it's like I don't look for Arabs; they're everywhere.
You're there.
But I'm looking for, let's say, Cafe Eunice. It's just a very specific demography of whatever
Hmm.
depressed millennials, let's say, or whatever. But yeah, I think also because when you're in like a white majority country, there's a lot of organizing around like people of color. And I obviously can't call myself a person of color. I'm very white passing, but also I am not white and I'm obviously kind of outside of whatever. So I find myself mostly in POC spaces. And those are the people I relate to vis-a-vis whiteness.
Hmm.
But then the specific traumas and the specific histories, I gravitate much more towards other Arabs.
Well, have you ever thought about that? That when you were in Lebanon, you gravitated more towards American culture, American pop culture, tried to be more American, and then went to Vienna and started gravitating more towards Arabs.
Hello, no, so that's the thing. It's that because I've only been in Vienna the last 2 years,
Mm,
this whole sort of journey had started like 5 years ago.
mm.
And like 5 years ago, again, when I go to Cafe Eunice, it is to meet other Lebanese and other Arabs and Syrians and Palestinians and people who are just like, kind of like-minded. When I say I wasn't looking for Arabs, it's because they're everywhere.
Yeah.
It's not, if you go to Lebanon, you're like, okay, I want to meet some Arab people. It's the weirdest thing to say because it's like everybody. But also there's a familiarity in people's eyes that I long for. The kind of recognition when you look at people in Lebanon and you just know types and you can kind of get a sense of people that I'm disconnected from here. Actually, I have a really great story because obviously most people don't think I'm Arab. They don't suspect it. You know what I mean? I was on a train very recently from I was going to visit Hisham in Belgium, so I'm passing through Germany, and I get on my second train from Frankfurt to Brussels, and this like older man comes and asks if the seat in front of me is taken. I'm like, no, go ahead. And he looks at me, he's like, sorry, where are you from? And I say, I'm from Lebanon. And he says, Ahla wa sahla. And I'm like, where are you? أنت من وين? قال لي من سوريا. I was like, okay. How did you know to ask? No one knows to ask.
No, yeah.
But he did say something that was like super validating. He's like, شفت بعيونك. I could see it in your eyes.
My God, that gave me chills right now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like we're so dark sometimes. We're so morbid, but we're so deep. I
Mm.
mean, حتى تقبرني, حتى some of these like terms of endearment, some of the jokes. I don't know, it's just like an immediate bond that I long for so much. I dream every night of Beirut. I'm in Beirut every night. Good dreams, bad dreams, funny dreams, wish fulfillment dreams, you know what I mean?
I get it. I mean, I left my life in America and I came here. So I get it to a certain extent. And it's always like a desire to be around like-minded people. When I was growing up in the States, it was in a small town in Texas, and there weren't very many Arabs at all. And so being Arab was what my parents defined it as. It was
Mm,
being Muslim, Arabs do this, Arabs don't do that. You need to be careful how you act because other Arabs can see, and you need to be a role model. So it was very confining. And at the same time, there weren't that many people that I could pick and choose, who I wanted to be friends with. It was just that tiny Arab community that I thought at the time stuck with. Now I think some of them were pretty cool, but I was just an asshole back then.
mm,
Um, but yeah, so it was like something I wanted to rebel against because it was so confining and because I didn't see so many people that appealed to me. And then I came to Palestine and then I came here, and obviously there's all sorts of different kinds of people with all sorts of different personalities and tastes and penchants and etc. And that's why I came here, is just so that I can be closer to my culture, but on my own terms,
yeah.
and to be around people that also have that look in their eye. Yeah.
But it also, yeah, it's the search for yourself as well. Because what I find when I'm even now here watching like a documentary, I recently watched a film by Jocelyn Saab called Beirut Ma Ville, My City. And it's filmed in 1982 in Beirut, in West Beirut. And there's a narration, which is a poem written by Etel Adnan. It's a beautiful film. It's harrowing, but watching it, I'm like, I see so much of the madness of my family that then passed on to me. The specific kind of like desire for a chaotic order, you know,
Mm,
but also the constantly holding on to certain contradictions all at once. I see it and it helps. It kind of makes me feel a bit like I belong to a certain thing. So it was 2019 that was the first feeling of belonging. Before that, I did have a huge identity crisis because I did not want to be Arab, but then I did not feel like I could belong to for one reason or the other.
yeah.
I think part of then actually understanding how white supremacy works and imperialism and colonialism, it
Mm,
was helpful to like deconstruct the like, I'm not white, I never was. Um, but then there is also like a lot of I can recite so many Bob Dylan songs, but how many poems by Mahmoud Darwish can I quote or whatever, or like whatever Khalil Gibran.
mm,
But then also the music and to kind of grow an appreciation for. I think one huge thing for me was honestly the sort of like new wave of Lebanese comedians. Because growing up, the only Arabic comedians we had were like, I mean, the ones that I knew of.
yeah.
And there's a still they still held a big place at the time really cringe, and we're very much catering towards white people or towards the white person in your mind.
Mm,
We Arabs, you know what we do, we blow stuff up, ha ha ha.
mm.
It's this new wave of kind of underground subculture
The guy with the
that I
fucking
was,
puppet, I hated that guy. He
oh
sucked.
my God. Oh, no, no,
What
no.
his name was.
No, no,
Yeah.
fuck that guy. Ahmed the terrorist, whatever. No, that guy's beyond.
Okay.
I
Well,
mean more like the Lebanese guys,
oh, okay.
who were actually Arab, but they're still around. Who's this guy? He's like a big guy. Cringe, cringe.
Mm.
But now comedians like Noor Hajjar and Shadin and Hussein Aout and whatever, like, I mean, have you seen Hussein Aout's like his like awkward
No,
stand-up routine?
no, I haven't. I need to see that.
It's phenomenal.
I like awkward
It's
generally. They do good
yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
They do really good stuff, but also it's like actually that is our comedy, that is our humor.
Hmm.
It's really dark, when he's like talking about, I don't know, the war and he's making jokes, but like really intimate and like he lived it. This is his life. And so not just connecting to people like Sabah and Fairuz and Kulthum, but like towards this feeling and these actual scenes, also connecting with the queer community in Lebanon, obviously, and in Beirut specifically, again, really grounded me more towards my people,
Mm.
and the feeling of who are my people? Where do I belong? Who do I want to fight for and who do I identify with? And again, a big part of it is also like I say I'm Lebanese, obviously, but oftentimes I say I'm from Beirut because I think Beirut specifically creates this type of mess. You know what I mean? Like whatever I am in my weird whatever.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think we're slowly going to wrap up. On a final note, I'll ask something. I mean, you kind of referred a lot to your work as a thing that you've been doing to kind of direct a lot of focus and attention and energy. That's obviously like distracting, but also kind of a productive way of doing stuff or whatever. But since this is a podcast called Politically Depressed, and one thing I talk a lot about is the actual like affect, you know, when I say I'm depressed, I think there's a lot of things that come to people's minds. I speak a lot about like being immobilized, mute, you know, just being at the supermarket crying. Like sometimes the thing that's happening and the thing that I'm trying to do, one little practice I've been trying is to like recognize moments of joy. I'd be sitting there with my partner napping and then my cat next to me napping, and I'm just like, this is nice. Everything is so horrible and I'm so nervous and worried all the time, but it's like clocking those moments because the scary thing is, and as you and I both know, we don't know the good times until they're over. When it's like, oh, that was actually kind of nice. We were always miserable, but it's like, fuck, if I could go back to 2000, you
Mhm.
know, 19.
Yeah.
So I don't know, do you have anything other than work that you think is like a practice that you're doing that's kind of like sustaining and nourishing and like grounding or something?
Yeah. So you're talking about watching reels, and I was just thinking to myself how much of a one-track person I am because my entire Instagram is just Gaza, 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 Israel, Israel, Israel. You might say obsessively, but I'm Palestinian. It's hard to get myself out of it. But also, I got to the point where it was really getting to be a lot. I was getting burned out. It even stopped, like, I don't know. You feel a duty to constantly watch and keep up. And then eventually, yeah, burnout is the best word. But so gradually, I've been doing a lot more stuff with my hands. So I like to buy secondhand and antique furniture and renovate it. I've been doing some gardening. I moved to a new house a couple of months ago, so I've been just like decorating it. Honestly, those are the main things that I've been finding joy in, aside from like socializing and friends and stuff, just because, and of course my cats. I got three cats. But just because my situation is it's more than October 7, it's also not having family in Lebanon and kind of being on my own throughout this 7 months, going on 7 months of war. Yeah, it's been bleak, but not in a bad way. I'm not like defeated or sad. I'm sad for Gaza. I'm not sad for myself or anything. I'm like, I'm pretty happy on a
How,
personal level, I guess.
sorry, the question that was coming to my mind is how?
How am I happy?
Yeah, despite it all, or in spite of it all.
I am a person that will just keep on going out of spite. So out of spite for Israel and out of spite for everything. But also it's probably unhealthy, but I just push it all down.
Wow.
Yeah. Like I guess I'm good at compartmentalizing about that stuff. Like I remember the day that the journalists were attacked, they were clearly marked, and Hassan Abdullah was killed, and my friend, our friends and colleagues were injured, and I had my colleagues with me. They're foreign colleagues, but they were really shaken. I was really shaken, but they were really shaken to the point where they felt like they weren't. They needed to take a break and have a drink and sit down. And I wasn't able to do that. So maybe it's not the healthiest, but I think I just keep going instead of stopping. And
Hmm.
I'm sure that's going to result in a massive burnout at some point.
Or an ulcer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a sort of like trauma anxiety tumor somewhere, kind of just like manifesting.
Word.
I'm lo I'm losing my hair. That's definitely a thing. But I don't know, يعطيك العافية. That sounds great. Honestly, I'm a bit jealous.
Really? Are you joking? I feel like it's so unhealthy.
I know, but honestly, like because for me, I still feel like I'm feeling those things, but I'm just not able to do as much. I mean, this podcast now, I'm doing some other work, but so much of the last couple of years has just been like me laying down, you know? I've got a cat, so it's like being depressed, anxious, in my head, not able to do anything with a cat on my back. So it's like not pure shittiness, but I do feel jealous of people who are able to then just feel that and just keep going. Like, I don't know. And that's definitely a Lebanese thing, you know? Like, غصباً عنه, and I don't give a fuck. I have zero of that.
It's a very Palestinian thing too. Like growing up,
Yeah.
my mom would be like, "Stop crying. You can't. You have to be strong." I think we've internalized a lot of that. And it's like no matter what, we keep going.
But see, the thing is I was told the same thing. My favorite Arabic term that honestly, like, as someone who was like really trying to think of mental health in a different way from the periphery, but also from a place of collapse and also from a place that's like the whole thing's collapsed, you know what I mean? An intergenerational trauma or whatever. But is this phrase, is the saying, blaya?
Yeah.
Did your mom used to say that? Oh,
Kid.
swallow it.
Yeah, of course.
And it's just because to me, I read that as a kind of like, don't recognize any hurt or trauma or sadness. And for me, it's kind of manifested in a way where I'm like super sensitive. And especially as raised male, I'm not meant to, much more so in terms of just like, boys don't cry. But also, yeah, faced with such violence and faced with such situations and whatever, it is hard to find any time to stop. And Hisham had this beautiful thing that he said when he left Lebanon that like he's leaving. رايح لأكتئب. He's going, he's leaving so that he can be depressed.
Mm.
Because being in Lebanon, it was just like, oh, you can't. There was no moment to stop. And I know still now, obviously. But then even at an intergenerational thing. So,
I do think the way that you're dealing with it, probably processing it, part of which is doing this podcast, is much healthier. Because when you bastablaha, you're pushing everything down, 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 like what I'm doing. I mean, the reason I do it is because if you stop and think about everything, you'll fall apart. And I just don't have the time to fall apart. I don't have the wherewithal to fall apart. I don't want to fall apart. But also, when you fall apart, that's how they win. And
I know. This is the dilemma. This is the fucked up thing.
I'm telling you, I go on, I will just keep going out of spite forever. Just pure spite, I think. Um, and it's not just Israel that wins, it's also the regime that wins. It's also the Lebanese regime, the Syrian regime,
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nado. As always, I love talking to you, and I hope you do. I hope you remain well. And yeah, look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you. We'll talk soon. I missed you, and I had a lot of fun talking to you.